Welcome to the Dark Ozarks. We are diving into the noir tales of the Mississippi River area of the Northern Ozarks. The Mississippi River brought more than supplies to the settlers in the Ozarks. We will get back to that in a minute, but first we want to remind you that the Dark Ozarks podcast is now available on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, and about any other podcast platform. So what is not so obvious that the river brought to the Ozarks?
The Mississippi River was always central to expansion and trade in the region, and some very famous people came through in roles that you may not be familiar with. Also, there's some very interesting lore, some of it pretty dark.
We'll pick up with the dark history and lore in a minute, but first we want to invite everyone to like, follow, etc. Dark Ozarks on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. Plus, we encourage you to follow the podcast. We would like to invite you to become a Dark Ozarks subscriber on Facebook, on the Dark Ozarks Facebook page. Click subscribe. Have your login information ready and join Dark Ozarks behind the scenes for $4.99 a month.
And come with us on investigations, deep dive research, and topics too controversial for public view. The next 100 subscribers will be entered in a drawing for a free Dark Ozarks t-shirt and an exclusive signed first-run copy of the book, Dark Ozarks, The Spooklight. Join today to be entered in the drawing.
And now you can get Dark Ozarks t-shirts for sale at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com.
We encourage everyone to check out Always Buying Books in Joplin, Missouri, in person and online, on Facebook, and their website, alwaysbuyingbooks.com, for all of your reading needs, including a large section on the paranormal, history, and more. Not to mention, the building is haunted. Tell Bob and Elise that we sent you.
We also want to thank Beard Engine Brewing Company in Alba, Missouri. Beard Engine Brewing is the only English-style brewery in Missouri and twice named Missouri's best brewery by the Missouri Brewers Association. Great beer and food in a historical building with a noir past. And yes, this one's also haunted. Tell Nate and Tiff that we sent you.
I'm ready to go back to both, but tonight we're talking about things going on the opposing side of the Ozarks. And dealing with Northern Ozarks and the Mississippi River, which of course brings us to places like St. Louis, St. Charles, Missouri, and interestingly enough, just because of the historical, cultural, and folkloric connections, Cahokia, the Cahokia Mound, and Alton, Illinois.
Yes. And it goes back a long ways, a lot further than people think in history.
It does. It very much does. And you and I had the opportunity to go on an investigation and survey several locations in that area last spring. It was a great opportunity to get over there. And just as a geographical note, a good chunk, I would say about a third of the St. Louis metro is geologically within the Ozarks.
Yes. And it may surprise a few people that the Ozarks geologically actually jump the Mississippi and part of Illinois is included.
They do. Now, is a strict interpretation. There is a portion of those Ozark Mountains that are on the other side of the Mississippi River. And what happened at some point eons ago was that the Mississippi River cut through the geological Ozarks and to create that. What is also interesting, and this goes back to for myself, the early days of State of the Ozarks, and looking at how do we define where are the Ozarks, and you look at geographically, you look at geologically, but you also look at culturally, and you look for overlays or points of recession. And by recession, I mean recession of culture. The culture recedes and is replaced by something else, or the culture expands into areas that are not strictly Ozarks. And it creates a series of moving boundaries on the Ozarks. that include, but is not limited to, the strict Ozarks Plateau, which is in and of itself massive. And this is one of those great examples because in relationship to the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers, and in relationship between central Missouri, northern Missouri, and also Illinois, you just have a lot of really interesting space.
You really do. You really do. And in a lot of history and lore that don't seem to go together, but in some ways make sense. I don't know about you, but why don't we start with the Piasa Bird?
I think so. Now, the Piasa Bird is an important part of our very American folklore.
Yes.
And it is pre-Columbian in its origins. And you can see a rendition of the Piasa Bird just north of Alton, Illinois, on the bluffs, on the cliff bluffs overlooking the almost said Illinois River. The Illinois empties right in there. The Mississippi River.
Yes.
And this is significant Native American iconography, from what we can tell, that dates certainly back to the 1760s, documentably. It is reasonably apparent that it dates back much earlier, and it may have been associated with the Cahokia Mound city dwellers, the city people, the Mound people, and it may have been associated with other tribes, possibly including the Illinois or the Peoria peoples. So there's a lot that we don't know about the Piasa Bird. What we do know it is a very unique creature.
Yes, it is. And the version that people, either if you have seen it or you then Google it to see what we're talking about, is different. Not only the fact that it's a different painting, but a different appearance than the original.
Right.
And I think in part, a lot of the sort of culture of the last 100 years affected the rendition of the replacement. And honestly, the early accounts of the original painting reminds me in some ways a bit of the Ozark Howler, which is not to say that gives it more credibility that the Howler is a real creature.
Well, there is a chimeric quality to these creatures.
Mm-hmm.
And there is an aspect of one type of this animal combined with the type of that animal, a fish's tail, a deer's antlers, a tiger's face, according to Marquette. In some cases the body of a calf or a bull. There's a lot of moving parts to this, and there's also the very interesting reference of the Piasa Bird being conflated with what was called a water panther.
Yes. Which is sort of a unique concept, but it is reminiscent of lake monsters around the world. Really.
There's some really, to me, there's just a lot of neat pieces come together.
Mm-hmm.
And we have our own Piasa Bird who's sharing.
Yes, we do.
my hats off to Milo, the water panther.
Yes.
My
new nickname.
Yes. My Milo is of course, on the podcast, you can't see what we're talking about. Milo is, what type of dog do we surmise Milo?
Principally American Foxhound.
Yes. And then sometimes a very vocal American Foxhound. But he is
Yeah.
a sweetheart. He is absolutely a sweetheart. And he is one of two mascots at Dark Ozarks.
Yeah.
And our other mascot is currently and thankfully asleep in my bathroom. That would be Guy, the Basset Hound. There's the concept of the water panther. Now there so many aspects of Piasa that I just kind of want to play with, but I think the first one that really jumps out to me, yes, combinations of creatures into a larger mythological symbol have existed in many cultures for pretty much, throughout antiquity. But there is, to me, something deeply resonant and uniquely North American about the Piasa. And it is the implication of a almost shape-shifting creature, especially if you do conflate it with the water panther.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different meanings that you can draw from that. The colors, the original colors that Marquette reported have their own symbolism. The idea that this being painted in a dominant position on the approaches of the Mississippi River said that this was a huge statement to those traveling the river at the time. And one of the biggest opinions, the surmised about this was saying you are entering into this territory. And that would imply that this particular people, which may or may not have been the Cahokia mound builders, but it's reasonable to surmise that it may have been at one point, that it could have been functioning not just as a road sign, but as a warning that this particular territory, you have been warned.
Yes, whether warned to stay away, warned that they are in control, etc. And that makes the most sense to me, because whoever painted it went to a lot of trouble to do so, and it would not have been easy to have physically accomplished with the nature of the bluffs, particularly at least 600 years ago. If you add in the Chinese archives that have the records from the Xinghu expedition in the 14th century, that have detailed descriptions of the river, of the area, and of the painting, which would indicate that the painting was there at least that long ago, and who knows exactly how long before.
Right. And it's backing up for a moment on that. There is the discussed 1430 expedition by the Chinese explorer into what now is believed to be into the American Midwest.
Yes. And there had been some discussion, I know, in earlier times, that whether or not they had actually made it to North America, that they didn't discount the expedition, but felt maybe they had ended up somewhere else. but there have been artifacts found along the West Coast that are accepted to be tied to that expedition, and then the records of the expedition in the Chinese archives are very detailed and match up geographically. That would indicate that they really did get into the interior and at least to the Mississippi.
Yes. And to me, I think that is really interesting and exciting because it is a peek beyond the established narrative of history.
Yes. And sometimes history is established, but we just don't happen to look at it from that viewpoint. It's established in Asia, but sometimes we, in the Anglo world, we are guilty of putting blinders on, and if we didn't write it, it doesn't exist.
Well, and I would say that is an issue innate to most cultures.
To an extent, yes. I think we tend to do that quite a bit, though.
It is definitely a blind spot that occurs, and I think for clarification, one of the things that to me is very important is that these additions or these more complete contextualizations of existing history does not necessarily negate our established history itself. That I can hear a variety of conspiracy theorists angry at me now for potentially saying that, but that there's many more things that happen. One of the things that we clearly see with in European expansion to North America after 1500 is not so much that these had to be the first peoples to ever arrive in North America, but this was the first time, particularly with the Spanish Empire, the French Empire, and the rise of Tudor Britain and the Elizabethan expansion, that European powers had enough military and economic force to move forward, rather than and do so in very large migratory numbers, particularly from Britain, and to do so also in approximate historical structure with the printing press. So there was heavy documentation, there was heavy promotion, and there was really the beginnings of mass media communication, mass marketing of opportunity, etc. So there were many firsts beginning in 1492 and moving forward into what we think of as modern history. But that doesn't negate the realistic possibility and sometimes documented reality of many peoples not having an economic empire behind them, but still doing really incredible things, notably traversing the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans in order to do exploration. And it reminds me of a great bit of lore that is associated with a Welsh expedition ending up in the middle of North America.
Yeah, actually Minnesota, if I remember right.
And then I believe moving south.
And it's very realistic. And it's Prince Maddox, isn't it? And again, someone that obviously had resources, just as in this situation with the Chinese. Of course, you had the force of a very large economy and government behind the expedition. And the expedition stopped at various islands and so forth through the Pacific, and was on look for trade routes. And so, which they did exploit to a great deal. But it also made sense that they got to North America and probably decided that establishing a trade route clear over here with the sparse population relatively that they found probably did not make sense in comparison to some of the other opportunities.
And that's reasonable. But it is also, to me, really fascinating how some of these, which would have been certainly at the time, or certainly for the individuals involved, monumental effort to achieve this, and yet it has all but passed out of history, and certainly has passed largely out of public consciousness.
And I think that goes to the fact that so much of what we remember of history is based on the stories that we're told.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And it also highlights why it's important to keep telling stories that are not well known, because they get lost over time.
They do. And we are by nature a storytelling people. And it is how we contextualize the world around us. I think it's also one of the reasons that various aspects of our historic narrative elicit such strong feelings.
Mm-hmm. That's true. I think so.
That it is a part, not just the story itself. The story exists, and if you're not initiated into its cultural meanings, you could just look at the story and say, why are we arguing about this? But taking a step further, once you understand that storytelling is how we contextualize the world around us, the accusation that perhaps the story is unclear or is incorrect is very difficult at that point to see it objectively, because what is then happening is that the way that they have contextualized the world around them now feels under assault.
Yes, and can take it very personally at times.
And again, as we talked about, just the innate tendencies of human beings, it's easy to look down our noses and say, oh, we wouldn't make those kind of mistakes. But human beings, simply by their nature, contextualize the world around us this way.
Very much so. And that's sort of a thing with a theme with a lot of the stories we're talking about tonight, of worldviews and contextualizing.
I agree. And one of the things that I really enjoy about our just sort of the continuing narratives that we have is that sometimes we step on the toes of very, very regional or provincial opinions, but sometimes we step on the toes of very established academia, or a larger post-colonialist expansionist policy narratives that say, sorry, taking the museum to task. Oops. And I just enjoy that process, because it isn't about one side versus the other. It isn't about class, an upper class, lower class. It isn't about that. It is just picking apart, looking at the most objective data that exists, picking it apart, putting it back together, and just looking at it from as many perspectives as possible.
And I enjoy that process as well. And I think there's always benefit to doing that and trying to look at things from another perspective. You also tend to learn more about yourself that way too.
I definitely agree with that. And the other thing that I think is important, and just as a sort as a treatise on the subject matter, is that in many cases the worldview or the world perspective that is associated with particular data points is oftentimes extremely valuable. It's extremely warranted for respect, whether or not the corresponding and oftentimes very minute historical details that are being defended are correct or incorrect.
That's right.
So that was a long way around the block to say, I hear you and I respect you. I may not agree with you, but I hear you and I respect you. And one's contextualization, not only of the world around them, but also of their culture and their history, is unbelievably important.
It is.
It's part of who we are.
That being said, we can jump. I guess we can kind of jump both feet into that exact question that ultimately resulted in a pretty infamous murder in Alton, Illinois.
I think that sounds like a good place to jump into. As there's a little bit of contextualization. Alton, Illinois is not part of the Ozarks. We discussed that, but it is in immediate proximity. It is directly associated with lots of historical points that clearly affected the Ozarks from the beginning of American history, and not the least of which was General Lyon's removal of the St. Louis Arsenal in the very, very early days of the Civil War, in response to Governor Claiborne and Sterling Price and some very notable Missouri State Guard members. And Alton to me is very fascinating. It is a quintessential Union, almost, river town. This is unabashedly a traditional Mississippi river town and river port town.
Yes.
That did certainly at some points in its early years, I suspect that its city founders were thinking it could give St. Louis a run for its money.
I think that probably was, especially since it actually is at the confluence of the Illinois River and the Mississippi.
Yes.
So
very
that should at least be on par, I'm sure, was their thinking.
I would think so. A lot of very interesting Illinois infrastructure being in Alton, not including a prison, which figures heavily. I love Alton. I think it's a beautiful town and a neat town to spend time in. It also is known as one of the most haunted towns that you could possibly imagine, and we got to explore some of that. And as you noted, it has a really unique history, particularly in regards to the abolitionist movement.
Yes, and at the same time, freedom of the press.
It's a good combination.
It is. It's fairly natural that there would be a strong abolitionist presence along, at a river port in Illinois. And Alton happened to be probably the most prominent one. And in the 1830s, Elijah Lovejoy was a prominent figure in the abolitionist movement, and also had a newspaper in town which did tend to strongly advocate abolition views.
Yes, and strongly rile up the pro-slavery mobs who would come and tear up his newspaper.
Yes, and and it should be noted, of course, that Illinois, it was a free state at the time, so these would be pro-slavery people. Some probably in Illinois, but a lot of them coming over from Missouri too.
And he had Elijah Lovejoy had originally started publishing his anti-slavery treatises in St. Louis, but because of his abolitionist work, of course, he was doing that in Missouri, and at that time, Missouri was a slave state. And then he was forced across the river and resettled in Alton in 1836, set up the Alton Observer, and his printing press was then tossed into the river by a pro-slavery mob. And then his second printing press, the same thing happened. And then his third printing press, the same thing happened. And this continued until, interestingly enough, November 7th, significant date for me, in 1837. So we're still dealing with a really early point in this cultural, at the time, cultural and political conflict as opposed to open war. But you think about this conflict going on in 1837, and it would be really 20 years later when we really get into Bleeding Kansas.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is very early in the process. I mean, this is before the abolitionists started basically trying to stock Kansas with numbers for their for voting for no slavery as it became a state. So this really predates a lot of this. And predates a lot of the violence in the movement that gets more attention, like John Brown, etc. But ultimately, there's a gathering, and they're trying to protect the fourth printing press. And it should be noted, too, that this would have been a significant amount of money involved. These were expensive machines, and at this point we're going on 4 printing presses, and a mob again basically attacks, throws it in the river, and ultimately Lovejoy is murdered.
Yes. Essentially in the mob action, he is fatally shot that night. In November 7th, 1837. He is considered a martyr for the abolitionist movement and a hero of the free press.
Yes, and I think that sometimes the emotional tones that still carry with people to argue the politics of what we think of as the 1860s, but obviously earlier as well, overshadows the importance, that of the role of a free press. Some people deride whether or not we have one now, but at this point in time, it could get you killed.
Yes. And
in your mind.
Right. As opposed to just getting trolled. There's a difference. That's a pretty dramatic difference. Something that just was perhaps just personally interesting to me, but Elijah's brother Owen uh, was an ardent abolitionist as well, but his homestead, which is now a national historic landmark, is in Princeton, Illinois, which is just up on the Illinois River, not far from where I grew up.
And he's considered an important figure for these activities as well.
Yes. And
I mean,
now,
go ahead.
oh no, just to say the really strong feelings associated with the abolitionist movement, is also combined with the fact that Alton was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and it was very strategically located because the slave state was just across the river.
Exactly, and it was a step towards going north towards Canada. And I think one thing that people often forget or don't realize is why the Underground Railroad went so far north was because at this point in the 1830s and until the Civil War, there were laws on the books that basically if a runaway slave was found in a northern state, they could be taken back.
Yes.
And so that's why there were stops all the way to Canada, because that was the only point that they were safe from being remanded back to slavery.
It was to essentially to get out of the country.
Yeah. And so there are several, I think, they say up to 8 major stops on the Underground Railroad in Alton. We actually saw a couple of them when we were there.
Yes.
Including the Ennis Apartments, which was a very interesting looking building as well.
It is. And
which originally was a mansion.
Right. And I think that it is fair to say that just like in 20 years later or 15 years later, many abolitionists were being funded to go to Kansas, that a number of individuals in the 1830s were making very specific financial decisions to establish themselves in Alton because of its strategic location.
Well, yeah, and for multiple purposes as well. I mean, not only just for abolition movement, but as well as for their larger livelihoods and business opportunities as well.
Yes, and of course the penitentiary, which became a prisoner of war camp for the Confederate prisoners of war, and then was the result of an epidemic which killed many of the prisoners. Much of this is associated with making the idea, certainly, that Alton is extremely haunted.
It one of the factors, yes, and in fact, there's what is called the North Alton Confederate Cemetery, which has a mass grave of the victims of the epidemics, and it was smallpox, mainly smallpox, was the cause of death, and over 1,300 soldiers died and are in a mass grave. Though it is now not unmarked, there is a 57-foot tall stone obelisk erected in 1909, and has bronze plates on all four sides, which lists the names and units of the deceased.
Yes. Which I
So,
think is very positive, and just, you know, it's certainly not something you would necessarily associate with an Illinois cemetery, because
right.
Illinois was obviously a Union state, a northern state, and something that I do feel happened, and I'm maybe broadly contextualizing, but I also feel that a number of key leaders, potentially including Lincoln, did lead the way in saying unification or reunification of the nation is going to be hard.
Mm-hmm.
In order to achieve this, we must not continue to fight the war culturally. We need to find ways to connect and move on in
Mm-hmm.
with mutual respect for both sides.
Exactly, and I think that's very important even today, because you see it divisive today, and people viewing it almost as a present tense environment versus looking at it in context of its own day.
And that's, you cannot judge the past, the people of the past, by modern standards or contemporary standards.
No matter how much you would like to, and it's easy to it's easy to do, because it's always easy to put yourself in a situation of that I would not do that, or you would hope you would not do that. But the entire set of circumstances and environment leads to a situation that does not exist today.
Correct, and really cannot. I mean, the modern standards, the contemporary viewpoints that we have, that we consider to be appropriate or moral or ethical, or however you want to cut that, came about as a result of the conflicts and the arguments and the soul searching that went on before.
Exactly.
It's
but there are a couple more points in Alton that really sort of almost highlight that process, including the fact that the final Lincoln-Douglas debate happened in Alton,
yes,
October 15th, 1858, which, and in fact, a large portion of the crowd was from Missouri, and listening to the debate, although it was for two senators, senatorial candidates for Illinois. And not only did those debates kind of set the narrative of the politics over the next few years, it was a illustration, almost an acting out of business interests playing into those politics, particularly the railroad. A big push that Douglas had was where to put the Transcontinental Railroad to benefit his investment, and that played into the on the ground conflict in Kansas that was starting to play out, had started to play out already as Bloody Kansas as this is going on. And so while you have people dying and slaves being liberated, good and bad things happening in Kansas and Western Missouri, it's being debated on the other side of the state, just on the other side in Alton, all at the same time.
It is. And a couple of points that come to mind for me with this socio-political and transitory milieu that we're dealing with in 1858. The first one is the fact that by steamboat and train, individuals came from all over, from across Illinois and from a number of points in Missouri to Alton, likely filled up the town. And in order for this to happen, and this steamboat transit, this train travel, comparatively very new, in terms of industrialization. The capacity to travel like this had not existed very long before.
Mm-mm.
And while it's the type of transit that we take for granted today, I don't think we necessarily associate it with the people of this era, the mid and early 19th century, or earlier 1830s to 1860s, of individuals, comparatively speaking, much like we are, going, okay, now we're going to travel. We're going to travel for business. We're going to travel for politics. We're going to travel for all of these reasons. And to me, that's just really fascinating. Something else that you said that is deeply resonating to me is that we often place ourselves with our contemporary body of knowledge into the past and say, I wouldn't have done that. I would have done this instead. I wouldn't have made that bad moral decision. I would have made this good moral decision. And while I respect fantasy role play, I think it's very important to classify it as fantasy role play, and us projecting ourselves into these points of the past, and consistently projecting ourselves as we're the hero. We would, of course, been abolitionists. We would have been making difficult decisions. We would have been conductors on the Underground Railroad. We would have fill in the blank for whatever era. Chances are, no, you wouldn't have. Let's be honest. The individuals who were making those very difficult decisions, which incidentally were going against the law of the land in so many cases, they were helping someone else's property leave the country. They were breaking the law in essence. They were making decisions that were not, in many cases, not popular, that had at that time problematic consequence. And there, comparatively speaking, weren't that many of them.
That's true. And, and there's various examples that go on in today's, environment that people look aghast at, and, oh my gosh, how can they do that? That's horrible. And in 150 years, they may be vindicated as having been on the right side of morality.
Absolutely.
So,
and
you
don't
know.
And if you're sitting here, now asking yourself, well, I can't tell. How can I tell? I guarantee you, most of the people in the 1850s couldn't tell that either.
Exactly. Another place in Alton that kind of wraps around these things is the Writer Building.
Yes.
And definitely a place I enjoyed.
Yes, and a huge shout out to the building itself. It is currently a restaurant titled by the name of My Just Desserts.
Yes,
it is a fantastic place to eat, and highly recommend it. Dark Ozarks recommends it. Gives the pie 5 stars.
Yeah, the pie's good. Good sandwiches, etc. And good cookbooks too.
Yes.
but it's interesting because to look at the building, you would have no idea some of the history that had gone on there. And I think that's one of those things that people have no idea what's happened right under their feet, basically. This is a building that, ironically, in the first half of the 1800s, was the courthouse.
Yes.
And Abraham Lincoln practiced law there. He gave a speech there, actually in support of William Henry Harrison, as well as it is believed that it is the site of the murder trial of members of the mob for the Elijah Lovejoy murder. It did not result in a conviction. And some people might be astonished at that, but it seems that a lot of times when there is mob violence, you look at different cases, a lot of those situations, convictions did not come through. And I think a couple of reasons. One, I think it's in the frenzy, it's hard to objectively be able to prove who the quote guilty parties were and weren't. And two, on a practical level, if you have a large crowd, and oftentimes, unfortunately, in these situations in the past, there generally were a number of influential people involved organizing, that it would become difficult. If you start convicting some, you'd convict everybody, and sometimes you'd end up convicting half the town. And what do you do then? And that's a very uncomfortable proposition that people wrestle with. But unfortunately, those things happen.
They do. They do. And it is an amazing building with so much history. But again, very easy to walk by without realizing all the things that took place.
That's right. That's right. And then I guess we should do a shout out to Mineral Springs Inn.
Yes, the hotel, which is a fantastic location for it. That Mineral Springs in the hotel is where we did our investigation.
Yes. And there are a number of businesses that are there on the first floor that you can shop at. There are ghost tours. There's basically a museum there.
Yes.
And if you ghost hunt, you can book private investigations. And it was quite an eventful night, so we do highly recommend.
We do. For anybody who is asking themselves, is this particular location haunted? It has been featured a number of times in various shows, etc. Is it hype? Is it actually haunted? Our opinion, it is very much haunted.
Yes. We had our personal experiences that would indicate as much.
Yes, we did.
And on that note, how about we switch over to Molly Crenshaw?
Yes, I find this in transitioning into this weird conflation between existent history, urban legend, and I would say things that resonate perhaps for unanticipated reasons. I do also want to give a quick plug to our Facebook subscriber option, because one of the things that we have talked about in the past, we may be talking about it soon, maybe tonight, I'm not sure, we'll figure it out, is some of the what we went through in Mineral Springs, and talking about that. And I'm going to throw this out here, either as a subscriber topic for tonight. Again, moving into that sometimes too controversial for public view. Step with us behind the curtain to see how we do stuff, how we discuss things. But in the case of the Mineral Springs, the possibility of interacting with a more forceful, and some people would call malevolent haunting. And not only there, but how do you, most of the hauntings that we deal with are not
Right.
negative. They are not malevolent. They might be somebody's a little upset or something, but typically no big deal. Sometimes you are dealing with things that push back a lot harder than that. That's one of the topics I thought we'd cover soon, if not tonight.
Sounds good.
But yes, the legend of Molly Crenshaw, set in St. Charles, Missouri. It is important to state it is an urban legend.
Yes.
Before we go any further, for the folks who might be in St. Charles, who are versed in this history, going, oh my gosh, they're going to get the history wrong, and they're going to send everybody off to go hunt the ghost of the witch who is dismembered. It is an urban legend, and so it didn't actually happen. But that doesn't make it any less interesting, as well as the fact that it points to a number of sociocultural elements associated with St. Charles to, at times, lend credence to this entire idea.
That's true. The urban legend version of the story goes back to a supposed freed Jamaica slave in the late 19th century named Molly Crenshaw, and that she was a voodoo practitioner who would perform and sell spells and potions for local townsfolk. At this point, I mean, you basically have lifted Mary Laveau from New Orleans and transplanted her to St. Charles, Missouri. The urban legend goes that, there's a horrible, harsh winter, and, people are starving, and they blame Molly and her witchcraft for, bad times coming upon them. They storm her house and confront her. She puts a curse on them, but she is attacked and killed. And various versions say that basically her body is dismembered in one fashion or another, with the idea that they did that so that it would sever her power and that she could not come back from the grave, basically.
Right. It's just some historical contextualization. St. Charles has essentially been around forever in terms of American history. The city was founded in 1769, just a few years after St. Louis was founded. It's on the Missouri River, right before the Missouri empties into the Mississippi. It was, it was St. Charles is where the Lewis and Clark expedition, from whence they left in 1804, up the Mississippi, or up the Missouri River. And it interestingly enough, St. Charles was the state capital of Missouri from 1821 to 1826, when the capital was moved to the freshly constructed Jefferson City.
Yes, basically they had to wait for it to be constructed. So, and I think one thing about the urban legend is that it does point to the fact that voodoo was practiced in the area, and we do know this to be true. On another episode, we've discussed in the past that there was a murder trial in St. Louis in, I believe, 1904, accusing someone of murder by voodoo and hoodoo. And the star witness against the defendant was another hoodoo practitioner from St. Charles. That practitioners and the subject were fairly well known in the area for throughout this time period. And so, you know, the story has roots in the fact that it was practiced, and how it turned to this sort of this morbid version of dismemberment after, you know, mob killing. If anything else, is evidence of a healthy respect for the voodoo practitioner and their powers.
And in some way, its existence in the psychological headspace of the area.
It really does. Now, it indicate, you know, from research and everything, it kind of looks like the putting a voodoo story with a name, Molly Crenshaw, probably goes back to the 1950s, is what they seem to think. Sort of the earliest accounts were them looking for her grave. And the flip side is there was a Molly Crenshaw.
Yes.
But she was not a voodoo priestess, and she was not some freed slave from Jamaica. She was an Anglo school teacher.
She was a likely very depressed 52-year-old single white girl, born in St. Louis, who committed suicide by swallowing carbolic acid
in 1913. And actually, carbolic acid, which was something that at the time you could buy at the drugstore, was a fairly common means of suicide. I've researched a number of stories that involved suicides by carbolic acid. And so, in everything that I've ever read, or the accounts, it is a rather gruesome death. It's not quick, and it's painful, and sometimes not enough poisonous would be taken, and so that they would linger, but there was nothing doctors could do for them. And so if they knew something of her actual story, there may well have been tales of it being a very, you know, sort of a horrific death that may have gotten conflated with the dismemberment story. But you know, it's to be perfectly honest, Miss Crenshaw would probably be just as surprised as anyone else that she was somehow misidentified in this way.
I think that is realistic. I do think that it's difficult. We seem to have two simultaneously in opposition points of opinion about the past. One, the really symbolic, horrific moments tend to stand out. Things like the wars, tragic deaths, that sort of thing. But at the same time, we really regard, I think it's very easy for us to regard the past in rose-tinted glasses, that we see it as a kinder, gentler time when people were happier because they didn't have modern conveniences like indoor plumbing, apparently, and and central heat, two things that I enjoyed very much, and that and utilize on a daily basis, and that it's very easy for people to get very stressed and very negative about the modern world and the modern responsibilities and the pace of things. But the reality and the actual story of Molly Crenshaw is one that highlights the reality that for individuals in which things go wrong, something that is also indicated in the historical record is that at some point she lost her hearing. She became deaf for an unspecified reason, and that led to her no longer being able to work as a teacher because she couldn't hear, and that led to her killing herself in a really horrific manner. That it was not all sunshine and roses for so many people, and again, that theme of the positive things that we take for granted, or the positive viewpoints we take for granted, were built off of the incredible effort, in some cases the incredible suffering, of the people that went on before.
Very much so. And you know, in a ironic turn of fate, when this became an urban legend, then people went and sought out her grave,
Yes.
thinking that, you know, she was this voodoo priestess. But there were actually some grim tales that came out of that. They including an incident in the 50s where a couple of football players went looking for the grave, and apparently decided they were going to steal the tombstone, and met with an untimely end. And according to a local professor and historian who would lecture on the subject, Ron Achu, the boys met untimely end, and the sheriff's deputies found their bodies impaled on the graveyard fence.
And of course, we really don't know at this point. We need to do some more digging, or of course, if you're listening and you already have this information, feel free to share it with us if you would like to. But we're looking at just that rather chaotic maelstrom of information from the 1950s onward surrounding It's a Scary Grave, Tread with Caution or Else.
Yeah, and again, again, the momentum of the urban legend and these tales, which at least some would say this event did happen, comes about that same time period that so many of our urban legends were formed, that it really does point to broader societal anxieties and insecurities, pushing these narratives. And certainly, if this account is indeed accurate of the two boys dying in the search for the tombstone, I can see where the idea, she had to have been a voodoo priestess and powers from beyond the grave, etc., gained traction.
Yeah.
Although entirely fictitious.
And what do you think it is? I've heard a number of these types of legends. They are associated with many different graves. And something I was actually half listening to one late last night on YouTube, that because of course I was, involving, it was in Iowa, and it was a black angel in the cemetery, a black angel sculpture, statue. And and these college age students stopped in to visit the cemetery, and one of the students said something rude and touched the angel, and then they were all plagued with terrible luck and had these awful things happen to them. There was car accidents and getting thrown out of college for drinking too much, and failed relationships, and various family members passing away, and all of this. And finally, the teller of the tale, the person who had shared this, I believe, on Reddit originally, went back to the cemetery and made his apologies and placed some flowers on the grave, and did not look the angel in the face, because it gets mad when you do that, and retreated, and then his luck sort of got better, and so on and so forth. And there just seems to be something, especially in this sort of high school, late junior high into college era, demographic, that desperately wants apparently a haunted statue to make up stories about, a haunted grave to be afraid of, and then to test oneself by doing something rude.
Well, I guess there's a couple of things that kind of come to mind. So much of this comes up out of the 50s and 60s, and between World War II and Korea, and sandwiched between that and Vietnam. And it's almost as if those kids who, it's like they just missed the big wars, so they did not have the opportunity to prove themselves, quote, in that way. Go looking for a way to prove their bravery, their nobility, the rightness of their cause, so to speak, and if things go wrong, that there's a way to remediate it. You could also look at it as a battle between fate and free will.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly you have a young population after World War II that has a lot more freedom than people their age had before, and more free time, even more than going to college, but more free time, really, and not consumed as much by just dealing with subsistence. And so it's almost a battle of, so we have all this freedom, so is success with it, or getting to the next goal, is it a function of their own free will, or is there is fate still determining what's going on, as lots in life often have been before. And free time often creates its own monsters.
It can. And I think that it is something that is likely to have happened in the 1950s, immediately following World War II, and then moved forward in terms of consciousness. There is that innate introspective soul searching and nihilism that we see after World War One.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, of course, after World War One, we did have the Roaring Twenties, which was a time of economic boom. But the 1950s, certainly in North America, saw a time of economic prosperity the likes of which had never been experienced before. And so you had the potential for this introspective nihilism that was happening, that was being juxtaposed with being extremely well off in compared to the previous generations.
That's true, because even after World War One, you still had that nihilism, but you also had even during the 20s, you had a lot of unemployment that isn't talked about. You have shanty towns of veterans who can't find jobs, all before the Depression starts, and then it just gets worse afterwards. And so people were still preoccupied with subsistence to a large degree then. Or then when Prohibition came in, just getting drunk. And you don't do a lot of existential thinking usually when you're drunk, but there was more opportunity for that in the 50s, I guess.
Yeah, I think that there's some largely unspoken existential foment going on in the 50s as a result of these things, and part of it being as a result of prosperity,
but at the same time looming, the prospect of nuclear annihilation all at the same time.
It's a giddy mix.
It is, dichotomies.
On one hand, mass-produced cheese curls. On the other hand, we might all die.
Exactly.
Cheese
While
curls,
we're eating the
death.
cheese curls.
Cheese curls, mass death. Cheese curls. In case anybody wonders, I'm a fan of cheese curls.
Much more so than mass death. But on that token, that might be a good point to jump over to, speaking of mass death, Bloody Island.
Bloody Island is fascinating to me, and especially because in modern day photos, the island looks even more depressing than it was described in the 1830s. It's no longer an island because Robert E. Lee killed it.
Well, no, actually, he entered it to Illinois is what he did.
I have officially reached that point. Yes, he rediverted resources, but technically he made Bloody Island no more, so he killed it. That's my argument. He made it not an island.
Pretty much. And I guess for those who were wondering, Bloody Island basically started forming in the 1790s, silt building up as water flow in the Mississippi altered a bit. And so you had a almost mile-long new island that was causing the St. Louis harbor to fill in.
Yes. Yes.
Which is bad for business in steamboats.
Very, very bad for business and very untimely, because we're just seeing the development of mass transit based on steamboats.
Yes. And so basically they couldn't stop in St. Louis. And so the city fathers asked for help, and the Army sent young Robert E. Lee in the mid 1838, I believe, out to fix it. He was actually, people don't know this, but he was an engineer specialist at that point. And there was a lot of rumblings, particularly from Illinois, not to get rid of the island because it was benefiting Illinois ports. So that's when he came up with the, because at first the aim was to save the harbor and dredge it. So when it became a hotly contested issue, that's when he decided to basically go upstream a little bit, build a couple of dikes, which anchored Bloody Island to the Illinois side, which pushed the current back to the Missouri side, and within one construction season had cleared out enough of the harbor that it was navigable again.
And so a couple of things that people may not be aware of, and the biggest one is that prior to extensive flood control, clearly beginning here in the 1830s, but not reaching its peak until really into the 20th century, there's various generations of river management to varying degrees of success that, left to its own devices, the Mississippi River and the Missouri River as well moved around a lot.
Yeah, it did, and it flowed a lot faster than it does now. Much more so in the 1830s and even later, even in the 1890s. It flowed very fast, and when it would freeze in the winter, they would have carnivals out on the ice, and they had to be very careful because when the ice started moving, they literally could be gone in 5 minutes downriver or plunged into the water to their death. So there are accounts of people, that there literally would be thousands of people out on the ice, and the people who were vendors, they had restaurants and everything else out there, becoming experts at the creaks of the ice, of knowing when they had to get off the ice.
And that there are just elements of this. Of course, I grew up in a river town on the Illinois River, and the elements of this entire process, a nostalgic, beautiful, genteel, layered and sophisticated culture that was built sometimes on the thinnest of underpinnings, that at any moment everything that you were doing could be destroyed by the shift of the ice, a single fire that devastates, that eliminates your entire downtown, a boiler explosion that kills everyone on the steamboat, and in some cases, in case of at least once, and I think more than once, the explosion of a steamboat in the St. Louis port that killed people blocks away. And
yeah, from shrapnel, yeah.
And because you were these beautiful floating palaces that we are so nostalgic about were essentially tightly wound bombs. Yes. That were loaded with, anywhere between 300 and 1,000 people. And this push toward extreme industrialization, this push toward modernity, but with almost no safety net whatsoever of anything. It really was a very wild and sometimes very dark and dangerous time.
It really was, but it's very interesting to to ponder that most people have never heard of this chapter in Robert E. Lee's life, and even had the Civil War never happened and he didn't have his military exploits on the battlefields, basically his actions opened up the Mississippi all the way down 4 steamboats. Yes. And basically these actions, fixing the river and the harbor there, enabled the Midwest to become the breadbasket of America.
Yes, yes, they did. And this mass infrastructure and the essentially, particularly in terms of the farming foundation that built Middle America, because the great cities of the Midwest were built upon agriculture, and all of this really taking place because of Robert E. Lee. I think it is absolutely fascinating, and most, I would say, the average person, even the average person familiar with Robert E. Lee, would not associate with him with St. Louis.
No. And if you go looking for the old maps of Bloody Island, the official maps were actually drawn by Robert E. Lee. So that's sort of interesting. But it begs the question, why was it Bloody Island?
Well, the first thing to understand is that these islands, not just Bloody Island off of St. Louis, but these islands, particularly up and down the Mississippi, were of crucial importance for one very interesting aspect of mid-19th century and earlier American culture that was technically illegal in most states.
Mm-hmm. It was illegal in both Illinois and Missouri after the early 1820s, dueling. But they also, it's not the only thing that happened in Bloody Island. They would also go out there for boxing matches and cockfights.
It's just
steamboat pilots would settle their differences on Bloody Island. They were in arguments.
It was a one-stop shop. What can we say? And it did sound there was a cottonwood break that was on part of the island, and that would have made it a lot prettier, actually. But great 1838 description stating Bloody Island in the midst of the rushing stream stretches out its barren sandy shores, and gloomy as the graveyard, a graveyard. And when the associations connected with its dark history are permitted through the mind, the appellation is no misnomer, a graveyard.
Yeah. Definitely apropos, considering, a number of people died there, all doing something they all knew was illegal, and basically doing it there just so that if you survived, that you wouldn't face prison.
Yes, and a number of really notable individuals participated in this.
Well, and very early I like the notation from the Illinois State Archives of a duel in 1817 between two lawyers, just Thomas Benton of St. Louis and Charles Lucas of Normandy, Missouri. And you read that and go, okay. But what you don't realize is that's Thomas Hart Benton, who became senator from Missouri and actually was the first senator in the United States to serve 5 terms. Basically, they fought a duel over insulting each other and whether or not Lucas had accused Benton of not paying his property taxes.
Yes, I think it is. My immediate takeaway on this is that we men, when we're younger, do some really stupid things, but that doesn't necessarily negate us from, providing we survive, going on to very illustrious careers.
Very, very true. Of course, the flip side is, the joke of why women tend to outlive men is because of things like this.
Fewer duels. Fewer duels.
I'm just leaving it there. I'm just leaving it there.
Yes.
Let's see. But it's really, some of the descriptions of the duels are really interesting because the whole idea behind the duels were, although they would say that it was to the death, generally, most of the time, neither party really wanted to kill the other. But again, have the last word and say, I was right. It kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about people's perception of morality in the past. And it really does come out of honor culture. But by the 1800s, it was starting to not make as much sense.
And
but it still happens.
And there's a great argument in, interestingly enough, a book that I've almost finished and need to get back to you, Honor and Violence in the Old South, that the culture of dueling, one of the reasons that it was consistently being made illegal and then consistently being allowed under specific circumstances, and the specific circumstances were geographic locations like Bloody Island that could exist outside of a conceptual or a literal jurisdiction.
Right. I mean, and technically that wouldn't be the case because the line is down the center of the river. So whichever side it was on at the time, which at the time it was on the Missouri side, something could be done, but practically speaking, no one wanted to mess with it.
And that sociocultural impact, the ideas is described in the book, and I think it is fair because it is really, I think it hits on one of the things that we've talked about a lot in this episode, which is holding two contrary ideas simultaneously for the theoretical betterment of society. And the idea that the singular combat and the strict cultural honor rules surrounding the combat meant that in many cases duels were not fatal,
right,
and it allowed a structure for two men to transition into conflict and then transition out of conflict. You do have to bear in mind, we might be horrified at the potential of loss of life, but let's just pick the 1830s, 1840s. Normal transit between St. Louis and New Orleans was taking your life in your hands simply by getting on a steamboat that might blow up halfway down the river.
That's true, or just spring a leak and sink anyway. And that duality is kind of apparent in some of these accounts. For instance, there's one from 1837 that rumor had floated through St. Louis that there was going to be a duel on a particular day on Bloody Island, to the point that a crowd went out to watch, and
Yes.
the principals didn't show, and then it ended up appearing that basically they had waited until the crowd left and then went out and had their duel. And as the paper reported, that they waited until the coast was clear of all spectators when they went out and had the satisfaction of shooting each other unseen and unmolested. And I think that points to that duality you were talking about. That it's we need to do this, but we don't necessarily need a lot of witnesses either.
Well, and the argument that's made in Honor and Violence in the South is that society needs detractors of dueling. Society needs to look at this and say it is a barbaric practice that must be outlawed.
Yeah.
And that society also needs dueling to essentially function as a pressure valve, as a societal safety pressure valve, to prevent conflict from spreading beyond just the two people that it's involved with.
True. I mean, and earlier when we were talking about Molly Crenshaw, we talked about the environment of the 50s that gave rise to the urban legend. As you were talking, it made me think, fast forward to the 1950s, and we're not dueling, but we're street racing and things like that.
Mm-hmm. And you look at the seemingly inexplicable actions of mob violence, which has continued throughout history. You look at gang violence of a wide variety of kinds. You could make a very inappropriate and technically inaccurate argument that if they had retained dueling and not made it illegal, we might not have had the Civil War.
I'm not positive on that one.
I'm not.
We might debate it later.
I just am sociocultural, chaotic, neutral. I just like to toss things into the milieu and see if they blow up.
I think another interesting juxtaposition that illustrates exactly what you were saying too is that the function of allowing the person challenged to pick the weapons and the distance and everything. So basically, the idea was, if you were going to have deadly weapons, you could have a distance far enough apart that you're not likely to die. And there's a couple of great examples exploring how this functioned. One was an early duel where the man that was challenged was nearsighted, and he made the fatal mistake of determining 5 paces for the distance, and as a result they both died of fatal shot wounds because they were too close to not miss. And then the opposite of using that smartly actually is probably the most interesting duel or not duel that happened on Bloody Island that people would probably be surprised about.
Yes, in 1842.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is perhaps just a footnote in history. I think it's an important one in American history, which was, as far as we can tell, Bloody Island was the location for this duel between a man named James Shields, who was in association with the Illinois State Bank,
Mm-hmm.
and a young Abraham Lincoln.
Yes, he would have been in his early 30s at the time, and a young lawyer. Mm-hmm. And basically, the state bank had gone bankrupt, could no longer accept its own paper currency, and Shields was the state auditor and sided politically with the decision to close the bank, and basically became a target for the opposition as the auditor. And Lincoln, perhaps not in his most diplomatic move ever, wrote an open editorial in the Sacramento Journal under a pen name of Rebecca, attacking Shields for his politics and his personal foibles, including basically insulting the man's looks.
Yes.
And it was published in part because Mary Todd, who he was engaged to at the time, thought it was a delightful idea, who then went on and submitted her own anonymous letter, further fanning the fire. And Shields finally had had enough and demanded that the editor reveal the identity, which he did. Which, he had just not, that would have avoided it. So he demanded a retraction by letter, and Lincoln refused to retract his comments and returned the letter with the request that he rewrite it in a more gentlemanly fashion, which of course just made Shields more mad. And so he challenged him to a duel.
Correct.
And so, of course, showing Lincoln's wit and intellect, he decided to make use of the fact that he was the challenged party. And whereas you could use whatever weapons in a duel, most people use pistol, he chose broadswords.
Yes, of the largest size.
Quit stating I didn't want the damn fellow to kill me, which I think he would have done if we had selected pistols.
And in terms of a strategic response, Lincoln said that he did not want to kill Shields, but he felt sure that he could disarm him if they were using swords.
Yes.
Lincoln was 6'4" tall. Shields was 5'9" tall.
Plus, Lincoln had been a bare-fisted wrestler, boxer, had used an axe considerably. So I'm sure he was in a much superior position with a sword than Shields. So on September 22nd of that year, they arrived at Bloody Island and faced each other with a plank between them that neither was allowed to cross. Lincoln swung his sword high above Shields to cut through a tree branch, and the act demonstrated the immensity of his reach and strength, and it was enough to show Shields that he was at a fatal disadvantage. With the encouragement of bystanders, the two then called a truce.
Yes. And I think what is fascinating about the story, 20 years later, the Civil War would mean that these two men would cross paths again. Shields was a brigadier general in the Army of the Potomac. Lincoln, of course, was president, and in March of 1862, Shields delivered Stonewall Jackson's only defeat at the Battle of Kernstown, and Shields was gravely wounded in the process. Lincoln nominated him for promotion to Major General, symbolically burying any ill feelings between the two men.
Yes, which again, this is just another example of how many times, we see in these stories in this time period, the same people crossing paths multiple times.
Yes. Yes.
So
over and over and over.
So, Bloody Island certainly has its its place in history, and the description that you read to begin with as a graveyard certainly is apropos. I
It is.
still would have loved to have passed down the Mississippi on one of those steamboats, watching two steamboat pilots dueling it out, though.
I would have too. It's, to say the least, and just the environment, the atmosphere of this era and this location is just the region, I should say, not location, but the region, the atmosphere. I think it left a mark. I think it's something that resonated into the future. And
I think you're accurate there. I really do. I really do. And out of that time period came spiritualism.
yes, which of course was a huge, essentially early modern paranormal movement.
Yeah.
In reality, that really, the Civil War threw a whole barrel of kerosene on that movement.
It did. I mean, for those wondering, I mean, it started in the 1830s in New York with the Fox sisters, basically seances, and start gaining movement and adherence. And then the Civil War just magnified the interest and the number of people interested, trying to, wanting closure, often for, loss of loved ones that ended up buried far from home, that they never had a closure for. And so in the same way that traditionally they would have through the mourning and funeral process. And so,
we see this, really, we see this for the first time. We talk a lot about railroads, we talk a lot about steamboats, we talk a lot about mass transit, sometimes associated with mass death, but predominantly mass transit. The fact that suddenly, for the first time, really in world history, large numbers of people were moving very long distances.
mm-hmm.
And we accept that reality. We take that reality for granted at this point.
We do. It's very common for, lots of family members to move thousands of miles away, and we just accept, okay, that's what people do, but they didn't. And then with the Civil War, you had hundreds of thousands of men going off to war, often hundreds or 1,000 miles away, and not coming back, which was unprecedented, really, particularly in North America.
It was, and you don't, for so many generations, and for such for it to have such an egalitarian effect. You look at large transitory armies in Europe,
Mm-hmm.
certainly some of that at various times. To a degree, we're not dealing with the vast spaces involved. Or in the case, if you go way back to transitory knights, you weren't dealing with something that was impacting the quote unquote peasantry, the everyday people. Not that there really was a middle class, but that we're dealing with something that would have affected the aristocracy and the military of the aristocracy, but not the common man to this type of degree. You
True.
See now these developments that certainly are very positive, socioeconomic developments that certainly we consider to be almost a birthright at this point. The idea that the common person, the person without a lot of means, can get in a vehicle or utilize some form of transportation and go to the other end of the country. And it's a big country. And do
Very,
that without an enormous outlay of expense.
very true. Very true. And so out of all of that, a resurgence of spiritualism happened after the Civil War. And you had a lot of people cashing in as well on it that were hosters and frauds.
Mhm.
And so at the beginning of the spiritualist movement, you had a lot of very serious thinkers being proponents, being supporters. Um, the rapid industrialization that occurred with the Civil War too altered a lot of perspectives, and so you had a lot of serious-minded people poo-pooing spiritualism, and then as certain spiritualists became more obvious as frauds and they were being debunked, it gave a black eye to the entire movement. And so and then there's also commentary out there that a lot of the people in the movement tended to be women,
Yes.
and they were drawn to it in part because they, or at least some, could have independence and prominence of their own that they normally would not find in society, particularly if they were not of the aristocracy. And so it tended to be women against, quote, serious men of science, that in some ways helped fuel the women's rights movement and the suffrage movement, actually, which people don't think about.
No, and I think it would be likely fair to say that talk about unanticipated allies, but that the women's temperance movement and the spiritualism movement both saw strong elements of this contributing to the suffragette movement and women's right to vote.
Yes, yeah, very much so. And so as time went on, it became more prominent, particularly, say, after 1900. You had a lot of, you had people who were almost vehemently and professionally pursuing spiritualists to out them, to debunk them, most famously Harry Houdini. And ironically with that, what a lot of people don't understand is that when he started in show business very early on, he started as a spiritualist and did spiritualist based acts. And so he was very conversant in what could be done as a hoax. And so as he saw hoaxsters really taking advantage of people, he pursued them, and so much media attention became focused on that. That was another black eye towards the movement. And then we have a very Missouri story that comes in late in the spiritual movement that really doesn't fit any of that.
No, it does not. And there's something that is, to me, really fascinating. The spiritualism movement, of course, began in the 1830s. It really got an enormous cultural push immediately following the Civil War because of the number of deaths involved. It seems to have ebbed and flowed during the intervening approximately 30 years, 20 years into the 20th century. But in the early 20th century, it experienced that revival that the deaths associated with World War I seem to
Yeah.
really push one last time before we move into what I think most of us would think of as a modern sensibility era.
Yes, that was dominated predominantly by psychology and Freudian and Jungian theories. And
yes,
so,
particularly Freud. I think,
yeah,
you know, I think Jung, especially with the almost metaphysical aspects of the subconscious archetype,
mm-hmm.
Almost lends itself to some of these ideas, especially in the research of deep folklore and association of folklore and belief structure. But Freud in particular, we see Freud and a largely materialistic view that I think is being heavily leveraged by things like corporate America, et cetera, for essentially herd management of employees.
Yeah, that I think that's fair. And then in 1913, we have Pearl Curran.
Yes.
And go ahead.
With comparatively little height, little stage presence, little any of these things that were associated with the spiritualist movement in St. Louis, begins to channel someone else entirely.
Yes, and it starts out as she has a friend, Emily Hutchins, who actually was a very accomplished writer and had works published in national magazines, etc. That they were friends, their husbands were friends, and now Emily Hutchins was interested in the spiritualist movement. Pearl never had been. And they would get together in evenings and the husbands play pinochle or in cards. And in 1913, about 1913, Pearl's mother dies. And so Emily suggests that they use the Ouija board, which had a very different connotation then than it does now, to contact her mother. And Pearl was not really that interested, didn't really think much of it. In fact, in writings and statements to other people, that, pretty much nothing happened, but, they would do this. And then one night, a personality started coming through, Patience Worth.
Yes. And
Patience is a conundrum.
That she is. Patience through Pearl would go on to write a lot and get it published. And for a comparatively short period of time, this woman, not Pearl, not the physical person, sort of physical housewife in St. Louis, but Patience, who is being channeled through her, is briefly renowned in literary circles and is well published with several novels and lots of poetry, and a very interesting suggested history of this woman.
Yes, and over the course of time from 1913 to Pearl's death in 1937, a number of very serious scientists will visit her, study this, watch these sessions and so forth, and not be able to explain it, but pretty much across the board, they would agree that they did not believe Pearl was making this up.
and there does seem to be an enormous amount of documentation about that, and the channeling became more and more sophisticated. It became more and more in depth. It became more complex, and transitioned even away from the Ouija board, where Pearl would just be sharing these things.
Yes, and automatic writing as well, at times. But they would also say that during these times that Pearl would maintain her own persona, and Pearl had limited education, and studying the linguistics and the information that was adduced, these very, serious observers did not believe that Pearl had the faculty to make this up and come up with all these things, and the writings flowed so quickly and changed subjects that with details from different time periods from the present to antiquity, they did not believe it was a hoax.
Correct. Which I think is probably the most existentially unsettling aspect of the story, because it really stands apart from a great deal of the commercial spiritualist movement.
Very, very much so. Very much so. The editor of the St. Louis Globe Democrat, Casper Yost, observed and persuaded them to let him publish some of the sessions, and he ended up writing a book, Patience Worth, A Psychic Mystery, that became very popular. And ironically, the Kerns did not benefit financially from this.
Correct.
That's another thing.
It is. And for people who aren't familiar with the case, essentially, is that Patience Worth, the woman who is said to have channeled herself through this 1913 era St. Louis housewife, claimed to be an unmarried English woman who had immigrated to Nantucket Island in the late 1600s and was killed in an Indian raid.
Yes.
And that she was originally from Portisham in Dorsetshire, England, and that her mother had worked as a seamstress for a nobleman family, and that she had been buried on Nantucket, and that a tree had grown out of her remains.
Nice touch. I like that.
So, Pearl's story, of course, is very complex afterwards. Now, there is the aspect that her friend was a spiritualist who was well established in literary circles. There's the, playing devil's advocate here, that possibly her friend saw an opportunity to work this out and was somehow ghostwriting, pun intended, ghostwriting and helping Pearl basically put all of this together.
Right. But by the same token, before too long, Pearl and her husband kind of dismiss Emily, and she's not involved anymore. And Mr. Curran takes notes. He's the one who takes notes in shorthand,
yes,
of what transpires. And ironically, they they kind of stayed away from the the psychologists, etc., that would kind of go after them when, to examine this. But they did allow Charles Corey, who was the chairman of philosophy at Washington University in St. Louis, to be present at some of the sessions. And he claimed to have solved the mystery, that basically it could be explained by multiple personalities. Although he had to concede that he couldn't explain how Pearl maintained her own personality while Patience is dictating, which would indicate that multiple personalities were not occurring.
It also bears in mind, for individuals who are not familiar with this particular case, that Patience is not just dictating a couple of journal notes here or there. She's dictating entire novels. Yes,
and numerous other, poems, short stories, everything. Over 4 million words. I mean, a lot of output.
Yes, and I found it particularly interesting. Patience's first novel was published in 1917, titled The Sorry Tale. The story is of one of the thieves crucified with Jesus. And the next year, the Joint Committee of Literary Arts of New York named Patience Worth one of the nation's outstanding authors. And that May of 1918, Holt published Patience's second novel, titled Hope Trueblood. I love this. The tale of a fatherless girl in Victorian England. And it was written in a 19th century voice, dramatically different from The Sorry Tale, a fact that Pearl explained by Patience's urge to widen her audience. Because when you're a 15th century ghost working through someone else, you really want to improve your demographic appeal, which I rather appreciate, actually. And I should note that a lot of the information that we have in this particular regard, there's a number of sources online, though the one that had some great context is from smithsonianmag.com, under their arts and cultures section, the article titled Patience Worth, Author from the Great Beyond, just in terms of source citation. So outside of this, I was peripherally aware of this particular case prior, but not to this level before preparing for tonight's episode. I've not decided, but I can tell you that there's something really magical about this idea, and certainly something interesting in the sense that a voice from beyond the grave being so markedly human, as well as the implication that this person was obviously a force of nature before death and continue to be a force of nature after death.
Exactly. I haven't quite decided myself. One thing I do find very interesting about this is that, we discussed how the debunkers went after the spiritualists, and ironically, Pearl allowed one of the most preeminent debunkers into her life, and that was Walter Franklin Pierce. He had been a Episcopalian and Methodist minister at one point. He was an amateur magician, and he had a PhD in psychology from Yale. And he was fascinated by abnormal psychology, and worked. He actually worked with Harry Houdini to expose fake mediums, and he studied Pearl and patients for 10 years. And he ended up writing a book and praising patients. And so although he basically was a professional debunker, he ended up basically accepting patients on face value.
Yes. So, I ultimately we leave it up to each individual to do their own research, arrive at their own conclusions. I think it is fascinating and an interesting peek behind the curtain, through the veil, potentially,
Mm-hmm.
to just really deal with some of those difficult existential questions. This one being, things are not nearly as simple as we oftentimes like to make them out to be.
That's very true. And like I said, I'm not sure that I'm quite to Mr. Prince's conclusion of that patients came through on our own, fully formed. I don't know, but you do have to wonder. There was enough examination by enough very serious observers that could not explain it, that it really does make you wonder. And going into Pearl's personality and life, she does not appear to be someone that could have successfully faked this, particularly over the course of 24 years.
I think that's very reasonable. I think that's very fair. So it is an open-ended debate, but it's something that I think the only sad aspect of the case is that the cultural focus, the literary focus, into the 1920s, into the 1930s, so on, really simply moved away from this particular situation. And I do think it's interesting that there wasn't a point of debunking, there wasn't a point of refuting the evidence, there wasn't a point. It just sort of simmered away and moved out of public consciousness.
Pretty much, almost, basically couldn't poke it with a stick any longer, so it lost its appeal in that regard, but never able to invalidate it either.
No, and from the some documented and some anecdotal reports, patients continue to communicate through Pearl up until Pearl's death.
Yes, and so as far as we know, Patience has not found another channel, but her works are collected into 29 volumes.
Wow.
And that might be a point to end on, to ponder.
Yes, it is worth the existential questions this Celtic Festival of Light evening of 2023. We do wish everyone a very happy Emerald.
Yes, we do. And don't forget to check out upcoming events and merchandise at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com. Thank you again to Always Buying Books and Beard Engine Brewing Company for bringing the Dark Ozarks to everyone.
And on our next episode, we're going to be discussing paranormal history of the Northern Ozarks and more. Catch the Dark Ozarks podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and other podcast platforms. Thank you, everyone. And remember, there are no easy answers in the Dark Ozarks.